And doctrinal orientation and grace orientation hook up and feed back and forth to each other. You start to relax, and then that helps you see the big picture better. And as you see the big picture better, you relax more. So I call it the Godot team, where you got grace orientation feeding to a higher knowledge. Then the higher knowledge, the bigger picture starts to fit together because you're more relaxed and can see it. That makes you even more relaxed. Well, then that feeds back to the bigger picture. So that's how spiritual adolescence basically goes. Now, at the end of it, at that borderline between gold and green, most Christians are going to peel off. Because what has to happen to go from gold to green is you have to fall in love with God. And that's why the next thing below the green says personal sense of destiny. Usually it's a very traumatic thing that happens. You become you independent of your family, independent of everybody. There's this vertical connection between God and you that solidifies. You see enough of the big picture to see enough of Him where you fall in love with Him. Now, it's not a sexual thing. They call it occupation with Christ. I know Watchman, he used that term. My pastor uses that term. I think it was pretty common in the 1950s. I'm not so sure how common it is now. But you become occupied with Christ. When you go to do something, you sit down in a chair, you're standing in line, your thoughts start tending more and more and more toward, well, how does God think? What does God want? Why does God want this? What should be in my head to please God? And it becomes more and more God-dominated, and you find yourself wishing that you could spend more time just studying the Bible to know God better. It stops being about being a good Christian. That's the preoccupation of childhood. Oh, I need to be a good girl or a good boy. Yeah, like kids are. All right? And in adolescence, you start to lose some of that. You loosen up. But when you become an adult, you become independent. And you won't notice it because I don't know, it phases in. The hallmark characteristic of making the changeover from gold to green to spiritual adulthood is that you just want to spend more time just knowing God for Himself. And you want to spend that time by studying Bible. It's a weight on you. And that's what happens that causes most Christians to never cross that border. They'll come up to the edge of spiritual adolescence at best. And they just won't go back. They won't go farther than that. Because they want the world too much. This is a divorcing that occurs between gold and green. You start, if you want God, because you're finite, because God is pretty much the opposite of everything on this planet, you find that you have to isolate yourself. The way most people I know who enter this phase put it, I have to get serious about doctrine. Now, there are a lot of YouTubers that are in this category, I'm happy to say. They're making videos, they're making comments, they're constantly, talking about God, thinking about God. And that's the sign of spiritual adulthood, the entry at least into it, is that your focus shifts from this place to God Himself, just because. Okay? Now, when that happens, like falling in love, there's a trauma that occurs because God becomes more important to you than you. God becomes more important than everybody else. And that makes the self nervous. I mean, I don't know if you've ever fallen in love before. I imagine you have. When you first fall in love with somebody else, there's this trauma inside because, oh, I'm not good enough for that person. There's a sense of insecurity because the other person is so much more important to you now. And that same thing happens especially with God. And most Christians don't weather that. They can't take it. You know, I mean, the atheist has a problem with believing in Christ in the first place because then he has to admit he's small, and he can't stand doing that. He would rather think that God is somebody who punishes you and beats you up. You know, he hears the burn part of the gospel, but he doesn't hear the believe part. The believe is easy. I believe. You can be 5 years old or retarded and believe, and that's it. Okay? He doesn't appreciate the grace of that. All he hears is burn. Why? Because he wants to think of it that way. He wants God to be a nasty God so he can justify not believing in him. Well, in the same manner, when Christians reach this borderline between gold and green, and everybody does, we all go through this, there's a real desire to reject it because I have to decrease. He has to increase. Just like John said, John the Baptist, I think it's at the end of John's Gospel, chapter 1. He must increase, I must decrease. That's what happens. That's the sense at the borderline. That will dominate your life and how you choose at that point. And it'll be zigzag. You'll choose for it, you'll choose against it. You'll choose for it, you'll choose against it. But over time, and this takes a while, you have to get to the place where you're predominantly choosing for, or you'll never grow up. And most Christians don't do that. They'll start out real gung-ho, and then they'll peter out. So this next phase of spiritual adulthood, which begins with a personal sense of destiny, that's my pastor's term for it. What that really means is how you are you in relationship to God. You have to completely reorient because God is now number one in your life, and you might not even recognize that's what it is. But as a result of that, you have to redefine how you look at you. And so you have to start examining, and you won't even know you're doing this. It's a natural part of the process. You end up having lots of thoughts of, okay, God is this, so I am this. God is this, so I am that. And you're constantly shifting your own ideas about how to define yourself in light of this new importance of this super importance of God versus you in order to enact him increasing and you decreasing. You have to keep redefining who you are. And it's not that you don't have to like tell yourself this is what you're going to do. It'll be a natural process of the phase. So that's what personal sense of destiny is. It's a basically redefining of yourself apart from the world, but in relationship to God and under him. So now you're becoming a spiritual adult. And like I said, it's a pretty traumatic thing, generally. As you're doing that, you'll notice that if we move a little bit right there, still under spiritual adulthood, you'll notice that at the very top box, we're solidly into diknumi as the main actor of the phase, pointing out, because you're redefining, okay, your relationship to God at this point. And then you'll notice that plaso starts right over personal love for God there in the second box.